Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Vince Morrison had always been a man of few words and calculated moves. At 52, his graying temples and weathered hands told the story of 3 decades in construction management, building everything from shopping centers to luxury resorts. What people didn't know was that Vince's real expertise lay not just in creating structures, but in understanding how to make them, and lives, crumble with surgical precision. He sat in his home office, reviewing the final blueprints for the Grandview shopping complex, his last project before retirement. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent his career building things that would outlast him, while his own marriage had been rotting from the inside for years. Linda Morrison breezed through the house like she owned it, which, technically, she did, thanks to their joint ownership. At 45, she maintained her figure and her blonde highlights with religious devotion. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floors as she prepared for another book club meeting that Vince knew damn well had nothing to do with literature. "I'll be late tonight," she called out, not bothering to look in his direction. "The girls want to try that new wine bar downtown." Vince nodded without looking up from his papers. He'd learned years ago that acknowledging her lies wasn't worth the energy. Their son Tyler, now 23 and fresh out of college with a business degree he'd never used, was sprawled on the living room couch, scrolling through his phone with the intensity of someone performing brain surgery. "Dad, can I borrow $200? I'm meeting some friends tonight," Tyler said, his eyes never leaving his screen. "There's cash in the kitchen drawer," Vince replied. It was always the same routine. Tyler would take the money, disappear for the weekend, and return with stories about opportunities and connections that never materialized into anything resembling responsibility. The Morrison household had become a well-oiled machine of mutual indifference, each member playing their role with practiced precision. Vince provided the money, Linda provided the pretense of a marriage, and Tyler provided disappointment with admirable consistency. But Vince had been playing a different game entirely for the past 18 months. Ever since he discovered Linda's affair with Robert "Bobby" Hayes, the real estate mogul who'd been courting Vince's construction company for a potential merger. Bobby was everything Linda apparently wanted in a man: flashy, loud, and rich enough to buy her attention in ways that Vince's steady, quiet success never could. The discovery had been accidental. A forgotten lunch at Bobby's office, a secretary who mistook Vince for a delivery person, and an unlocked office door that revealed Linda bent over Bobby's desk in a position that had nothing to do with reviewing property deeds. Instead of the rage that most men would feel, Vince had felt something colder and more dangerous: clarity. He'd walked away that day without saying a word, without confronting them, without even letting the shock register on his face. Instead, he'd gone home and begun planning. Because Vincent Morrison understood something that Bobby Hayes and his cheating wife didn't. The most devastating collapses always started with a single, carefully placed crack in the foundation. Over the next 18 months, Vince had quietly restructured his life like a master architect redesigning a building. He'd moved money, adjusted contracts, and positioned pieces on a chessboard that Linda and Bobby didn't even know they were playing on. Every book club meeting, every weekend that Tyler disappeared, every time Bobby called about the potential merger, Vince cataloged it all. The retirement party was Linda's idea, of course. She'd insisted on hosting it at their house, inviting colleagues, friends, and family to celebrate Vince's 30 years in construction. What she didn't know was that Vince had been counting down to this night for months, knowing it would be the perfect stage for the first act of his revenge. As the evening approached, Vince adjusted his tie in the bedroom mirror. Behind him, Linda was putting the finishing touches on her makeup, preparing to play the role of the devoted wife one last time. "You clean up nice for an old man," she said, her reflection smiling at him through the mirror. "Thank you," he replied, his voice carrying none of the warmth it once had. Tonight, everything would change. Tonight, the foundation he'd been quietly undermining for 18 months would finally start to crack. Chapter 2. The Inspection. The retirement party was in full swing by 7 p.m. Vince's colleagues from Morrison Construction filled the backyard, sharing stories and raising glasses to the man who'd built half the commercial real estate in the county. Linda played the perfect hostess, her laughter ringing out as she moved between groups, accepting compliments on the house, the food, and her husband's successful career. Bobby Hayes arrived fashionably late, as was his custom. At 48, he carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His tailored suit and Rolex caught the evening light as he made his rounds, slapping backs and name-dropping his latest acquisitions. To the casual observer, he was simply another colleague paying respects to a retiring peer. To Vince, he was a target that had just walked into range. Tyler had brought his girlfriend, Amanda Patterson, a 22-year-old marketing graduate who worked at her father's advertising firm. She was sweet enough, with brown curls and a nervous laugh. But Vince had noticed how she flinched every time Tyler spoke to her in public. His son had inherited Linda's talent for cruelty, though he lacked her subtlety. Quite a turnout, Bobby said, approaching Vince near the bar that had been set up on the patio. 30 years is impressive. Most guys in our business burn out after 20. I've always been thorough, Vince replied, accepting Bobby's handshake with a grip that lasted just a second too long. I believe in seeing projects through to completion. Bobby's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. About that merger proposal, I know you're retiring, but maybe we could discuss transitioning some of your contracts to Hayes Development. I'd hate to see all that expertise go to waste. I'm sure you would, Vince said, his tone neutral. Tell me, Bobby, what's your policy on structural integrity? The question caught Bobby off guard. I'm sorry, when you acquire a property, do you inspect the foundation first, or do you trust that it's solid? Bobby laughed nervously. Well, due diligence is important, but sometimes you have to trust your instincts and move fast in this market. Interesting philosophy, Vince said, taking a sip of his whiskey. I've always found that the most catastrophic failures happen when people assume the foundation is solid without actually checking. Before Bobby could respond, Linda appeared at his side, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture that would seem innocent to anyone who didn't know better. But Vince knew better. He'd been documenting these small intimacies for months. Bobby, I'm so glad you could make it, Linda said, her voice pitched just a little too high. Vince was just telling me how much he's looking forward to having more free time. I imagine you're both excited about the next chapter, Bobby said, his eyes lingering on Linda a moment too long. Oh, we have so many plans, Linda replied, her gaze meeting Bobby's with practiced casualness. Vince wants to travel, maybe buy a cabin somewhere remote. Vince almost smiled at that. Linda had never expressed any interest in traveling with him, and the idea of a remote cabin was probably her worst nightmare. But it was a useful fiction, one that supported the narrative they'd both been building about their happy marriage. As the evening progressed, Vince watched the two of them orbit each other like planets with a gravitational pull they thought was invisible. Bobby would find excuses to touch Linda's shoulder when they talked. Linda would laugh at his jokes, just a little too enthusiastically. They were good at it, Vince had to admit. If he hadn't seen them in Bobby's office, he might have missed the signs entirely. Tyler was holding court near the pool, regaling a group of his father's younger employees with stories about his post-graduation adventures. Amanda stood beside him, smiling on cue but growing paler with each drink Tyler consumed. The old man's been good to me, Tyler was saying, gesturing toward Vince with his beer bottle. But let's be honest, construction is a dying industry. The real money is in tech, crypto, that kind of thing. I've got some irons in the fire that are going to make his 30-year grind look like pocket change. One of Vince's foremen, a weathered man named Frank Rodriguez who'd worked with Vince for 15 years, shook his head. Your dad built this whole county, son. That's not pocket change, that's legacy. Legacy doesn't pay for a Tesla, Tyler replied with a laugh that made Frank wince. Vince had heard enough. He excused himself from his conversation with a group of subcontractors and walked over to where his son was performing for his audience. Tyler, he said quietly. Or, the tone was enough to make Tyler's bravado falter slightly. Sure, Dad. What's up? They stepped away from the group, moving to a quieter corner of the yard near the garden that Linda had insisted on installing 3 years ago. I think you've had enough to drink tonight, Vince said simply. Come on, Dad, it's a party. I'm celebrating your retirement. You're celebrating your own importance, Vince corrected. And you're embarrassing Amanda in the process. Tyler's face flushed. Amanda's fine. She can handle herself. The question is whether you can handle yourself, Vince replied. You're 23 years old, Tyler. When are you going to start acting like a man instead of a child who's angry at the world? Maybe when you start treating me like one. Tyler shot back, his voice rising slightly. You've been holding me back my whole life, keeping me under your thumb, never giving me a chance to prove myself. Vince studied his son's face, seeing Linda's features reflected in the weak jawline and entitled expression. I've given you every opportunity in the world. What you've done with them is your choice. Right, Tyler said bitterly. Everything's my fault. Nothing's ever good enough for Vincent Morrison, the perfect father, the perfect husband, the perfect everything. I've never claimed to be perfect, Vince said. But I've always kept my word, paid my debts, and honored my commitments. Can you say the same? Tyler's silence was answer enough. Vince turned to walk away, but his son's voice stopped him. You know she's cheating on you, right? Vince turned back slowly, his expression unchanged. Excuse me, Mom, Tyler said, emboldened by alcohol and frustration. With Bobby Hayes. Everyone knows it except you, apparently. Hell, half the people at this party have seen them together. For a moment, father and son stared at each other across a gulf that had been widening for years. Then Vince nodded once, as if Tyler had just confirmed the weather forecast. Thank you for telling me, he said simply. Tyler blinked, clearly expecting a different reaction. That's it? That's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say? I don't know. Get angry. Fight for your marriage. Do something other than just stand there like a statue. Vince considered this for a moment. Tyler, he said finally, there's a difference between fighting for something and fighting for the right thing. You'll understand that someday. As he walked away, leaving his son standing alone by the garden, Vince felt a familiar calm settle over him. The pieces were all in position now. The foundation was ready to collapse. All he needed was the right moment to strike the final blow. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. The retirement party had moved into its final phase by 10 p.m. The older guests had begun to leave, citing early meetings and family obligations, while the younger crowd had gravitated toward the pool area where Tyler was still drinking and growing increasingly belligerent with each beer. Vince found himself in the living room, surrounded by a group of his longest-standing colleagues and friends. Frank Rodriguez was there, along with several other foremen and project managers who'd worked with Vince through the lean years and the profitable ones. These were men who understood the value of hard work and keeping your word, qualities that seemed increasingly rare in Tyler's generation. To Vince Morrison, Frank said, raising his glass, a man who builds things that last. The group raised their glasses in agreement, and Vince felt a genuine warmth for these men who'd stood beside him through 3 decades of challenges. Whatever happened next, he'd earned their respect honestly. Bobby Hayes appeared at the edge of the group, his face flushed from alcohol and his tie loosened in a way that was probably meant to look casual but came across as sloppy. Mind if I join the toast? Of course, Vince said, though his colleagues shifted slightly to make room with obvious reluctance. Bobby's reputation in the construction community was well known. He was the kind of developer who squeezed contractors until they bled, then acted surprised when the work suffered. Vince, Bobby said, his voice carrying the false bonhomie of a man who'd had too much to drink. I've got to say, you've built an impressive empire here. This house, your business, your family. You're a lucky man. Luck had very little to do with it, Frank interjected, his tone cool. Bobby laughed. Well, sure, hard work and all that. But sometimes a man needs to know when he's peaked, you know? When it's time to step aside and let younger blood take over. The group fell silent. Even through the alcoholic haze, Bobby seemed to realize he'd crossed the line, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. I mean, no offense, Vince, but your generation had it easy. You could build a strip mall and retire on the profits. These days, you need vision, connections, the ability to think big. Like sleeping with another man's wife? The question came from Tyler, who'd apparently staggered in from the pool area without anyone noticing. His words slurred slightly, but his meaning was crystal clear. The room went dead silent. Bobby's face went white, then red, then white again. Linda, who'd been moving through the crowd saying goodbye to guests, froze in the doorway. "Tyler," she said sharply, "you're drunk. Go upstairs." "Am I wrong, though?" Tyler continued, swaying slightly, but maintaining his focus on Bobby. "You want to talk about vision and connections? How about the vision to seduce a married woman and the connections that come with pillow talk?" Bobby's hands clenched into fists. "You little shit. I don't know what you think you know. I know my mother's been screwing you for over a year," Tyler said, his voice rising. "I know you've been using our family dinners to pump my dad for information about his contracts. And I know you think you're so fucking smart that no one's figured it out." Linda moved toward her son with murder in her eyes, but Vince's voice stopped her cold. "Tyler." The single word carried such quiet authority that even drunk, Tyler shut his mouth immediately. "That's enough." Vince looked around the room, noting the shocked faces of his colleagues, the mortified expression on Amanda's face, and the guilty fury radiating from both Linda and Bobby. Then he smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made everyone except Tyler take a step back. "Well," he said conversationally, "this is awkward." Bobby tried to rally. "Vince, look, I don't know what kind of lies this kid has been telling, but—" "Bobby," Vince interrupted, his voice still calm. "Stop talking." Something in his tone made Bobby's mouth snap shut. Vince walked to the bar cart and poured himself a fresh whiskey, taking his time, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. When he turned back to the room, his expression was almost pleasant. "You know, Bobby, you asked me earlier about structural integrity, about whether I inspect foundations before trusting they're solid." He took a sip of his drink. "The thing about foundations is that they can look perfectly sound from the surface. You might never know there's a problem until the whole structure comes crashing down." Bobby's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Vince, whatever you think is going on." "I don't think anything," Vince replied. "I know exactly what's going on. I've known for 18 months. The confession hit the room like a physical blow. Linda's face went chalk white, and Bobby actually staggered as if he'd been pushed. 18 months, Vince continued, savoring the words. "That's how long I've been watching, documenting, planning. Did you really think I wouldn't notice, Linda? The late meetings, the new lingerie, the way you suddenly started caring about Bobby's opinion on everything from wine to wallpaper." Linda's voice came out as a whisper. "Vince, I can explain." "No," he said simply. "You can't. Because there's no explanation that matters. You made your choice. Both of you did." Tyler, sobered by the gravity of what he'd unleashed, tried to interject. "Dad, I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," Vince said, turning his attention to his son. "You absolutely meant to. You've been angry at me for years, Tyler, and tonight you finally found a weapon you thought would hurt. The problem is that you're too stupid to realize you just cut the rope you've been hanging from." "What's that supposed to mean?" Tyler demanded, but his bravado was cracking. Vince finished his drink and set the glass down with deliberate care. "It means that tomorrow you're going to learn what consequences feel like. All of you are." He looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of his friends and colleagues who'd been forced to witness this ugly family theater. "Frank, would you mind making sure everyone gets home safely? I think the party's over." Frank nodded grimly. "You got it, Vince. You need anything." "I appreciate that," Vince said. "I'll be in touch." As his friends began to file out, casting worried glances back at him, Vince walked toward the stairs. He paused at the bottom, looking back at the three people who betrayed him in different ways. "Oh, and Bobby," he said casually, "you might want to call your lawyer in the morning. You're going to need him." Bobby found his voice at last. "Are you threatening me?" Vince smiled again, and this time there was no humanity in it at all. "Bobby, I don't make threats. I make promises. And I promise you that by this time next week, you're going to understand exactly what happens when you mistake my silence for weakness." He climbed the stairs without looking back, leaving the three of them standing in the wreckage of their lies. Behind him, he could hear Linda's voice rising in panic, Bobby's attempts at damage control, and Tyler's growing realization that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Vince Morrison had spent 18 months building the perfect trap. Tomorrow, he would spring it. Chapter 4, The Blueprint. Vince was awake before dawn, his internal clock unaffected by the previous night's revelations. He dressed in his usual work clothes, jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen 1,000 job sites, and made his way to the kitchen. The house was silent. Linda hadn't come to bed, and Tyler's car was gone from the driveway. Bobby's Porsche was nowhere to be seen. He brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, spreading out a collection of documents he'd retrieved from his home safe. 18 months of careful planning lay before him. Contracts, photographs, financial records, and a detailed timeline that would make an FBI investigator proud. But this wasn't about justice in any legal sense. This was about something far more personal. The first document was a contract Tyler had signed 6 months ago, co-signing for an $85,000 loan to finance what he called a revolutionary crypto venture. Tyler had used his trust fund as collateral, the trust fund that Vince had established and maintained, and which could be dissolved at Vince's discretion. The crypto venture had predictably failed, leaving Tyler responsible for a debt he couldn't pay and a monthly payment that exceeded his non-existent income. The second document was more interesting. It was a comprehensive background check on Robert Hayes, conducted by a private investigator Vince had hired 9 months ago. Bobby's financial empire, impressive as it appeared from the outside, was built on a foundation of leveraged debt and predatory loans. He owed money to people who didn't accept late payments gracefully, and his cash flow was entirely dependent on a steady stream of new developments and quick property flips. The third document was the crown jewel, a detailed analysis of Bobby's current project portfolio, cross-referenced with environmental impact studies that Vince had commissioned through shell companies. 3 of Bobby's major developments were built on contaminated land that should have been remediated before construction. The contamination was severe enough to trigger federal intervention if properly documented and reported. But Vince's plan went deeper than financial ruin or legal troubles. He understood that men like Bobby and Tyler responded only to personal humiliation and social destruction. Money could be replaced, legal troubles could be weathered, but reputation and respect, once lost, were nearly impossible to recover. At 7 a.m., Vince's phone rang. The caller ID showed Linda's number. "Hello. Vince, we need to talk." Linda's voice was strained, exhausted. "This whole thing has gotten out of hand." "I don't think so," Vince replied calmly. "I think it's just getting started." "Don't do this," she said, and he could hear desperation creeping in her voice. "Whatever you're planning, don't do this to our family." "Our family," Vince repeated. "Linda, you destroyed our family 18 months ago. I'm just documenting the damage." Tyler didn't mean what he said last night. He was drunk, he was angry. Tyler meant every word. Vince interrupted. And he was right to be angry. He's been watching his mother make a fool of his father for over a year. The question is why he chose last night to finally say something. Linda was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. He's been asking Bobby for money. For his investments, his debts. Bobby's been saying no. Vince felt a grim satisfaction. Tyler hadn't exposed the affair out of moral outrage or concern for his father. He'd done it out of spite, after his mother's lover had refused to bankroll his latest failure. "Where are you now?" Vince asked. "Bobby's place. We need to figure out what to do." "I'll save you the trouble," Vince said. "You're going to pack your things and move out of my house. Today, Tyler can find somewhere else to live as well." "Vince, please." "I'm not finished," he continued. "You're also going to discover that the joint accounts have been frozen pending a forensic audit of our marital assets. The credit cards have been canceled, and the house, which you'll remember is in a trust that I control, is no longer available to you." He could hear her sharp intake of breath. "You can't do that." "I can, and I have. Check your purse, Linda. Try to use your credit card for coffee on the way home. You'll find it very educational." The line went quiet except for the sound of Linda's increasingly panicked breathing. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Because you made the mistake of thinking I was weak," Vince replied. "You and Bobby and Tyler all made the same mistake. You thought that because I didn't scream and fight and make scenes, I was just going to accept whatever you did to me. We can work this out," Linda said desperately. "We could go to counseling. We can fix this." "No," Vince said simply. "We can't. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed. They can only be cleared away to make room for something new. He hung up before she could respond. At 8 a.m., Vince drove to his office at Morrison Construction for the last time as an active employee. His secretary, Mrs. Chun, had been with the company for 12 years and knew him well enough to recognize the difference between his usual quiet mood and something more dangerous. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "there have been several calls this morning. Mr. Hayes called 3 times and Tyler called twice." "I'll bet they did," Vince replied. "Mrs. Chun, I need you to prepare a few documents for me." For the next 2 hours, Vince dictated a series of letters, contracts, and legal notifications. He terminated Tyler's employment with the company, effective immediately. He dissolved Tyler's trust fund, which was perfectly legal under the terms Vince had established 20 years earlier. He canceled the line of credit that Bobby's company had been using for quick project financing, a line of credit that Bobby didn't know was ultimately backed by Morrison Construction's assets. But the masterpiece was a detailed report to the Environmental Protection Agency, documenting the contaminated land that Bobby had developed without proper remediation. The report was meticulously researched, legally ironclad, and would trigger an immediate federal investigation that would freeze all of Bobby's current projects and expose him to millions in cleanup costs and penalties. At 10 a.m., Vince's phone rang again. This time it was Bobby. "You son of a bitch." Bobby's voice was tight with rage. "You think you can destroy me over some marriage bullshit?" "Bobby," Vince said pleasantly, "I haven't even started destroying you yet. What you're feeling now is just the appetizer. I'll sue you into the ground. I'll take everything you have." "With what money?" Vince asked. "Your line of credit was just canceled. Your EPA investigation starts Monday, and I happen to know you're about 90 days behind on payments to some very unfriendly people. How exactly are you planning to finance a legal war against me?" The silence on the other end told Vince everything he needed to know. "Here's what's going to happen, Bobby," Vince continued. "You're going to discover that your reputation in this town is worth exactly nothing. The contractors who've been working with you are going to find better options. The banks that have been financing your projects are going to start asking uncomfortable questions. And the people you owe money to are going to start getting impatient." "You can't do this," Bobby said, but his voice had lost its edge. "I've already done it," Vince replied. "The only question now is how long it takes you to figure out exactly how deep the hole is that you've dug for yourself." Vince hung up and turned to Mrs. Chun, who had been listening with growing amazement. "Mrs. Chun," he said, "would you mind calling the Grandview Gazette? I think they might be interested in a story about environmental violations in local development projects." As his secretary reached for the phone, Vince allowed himself a small smile. The foundation was cracking exactly as he'd planned. Soon, the entire structure would come crashing down. Chapter 5: The Demolition. By noon on Monday, Vince's war had moved from preparation to active destruction. He sat in his home office, methodically working through a checklist that would have impressed a military strategist. Each item represented another support beam removed from the lives of the people who had betrayed him. Tyler was the first to crack. He appeared at the front door at 12:30, looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. His usual arrogance had been replaced by something approaching panic. "Dad," he said when Vince opened the door, "we need to talk." "I don't think we do," Vince replied, but he stepped aside to let Tyler in. Tyler followed him to the kitchen, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to compose himself. "Look, I know I screwed up at the party. I was drunk. I was angry. I said things I shouldn't have said." "You said things that were true," Vince corrected. "That's not quite the same thing." "But I didn't mean to blow up your marriage," Tyler continued desperately. I was pissed off, and I want to hurt someone, and I was the easiest target," Vince finished. "Because you knew I wouldn't fight back. You knew I'd just stand there and take it." Tyler's face flushed. Tyler," Vince said, pouring himself a cup of coffee and not offering one to his son. "Do you know what I discovered when I dissolved your trust fund this morning?" Tyler went pale. "You can't dissolve my trust fund. That's my money. It's money I put aside for you, managed by me under terms that I established. And those terms include a clause that allows me to dissolve the trust if I determine that the beneficiary is using the funds in a manner detrimental to their own welfare or the welfare of the family. That's not legal. It's perfectly legal. I had the best estate attorneys in the state draft those documents. But here's the interesting part. Tyler, when I reviewed the trust's recent expenditures, I found some fascinating patterns. Vince pulled out a folder and spread several bank statements across the kitchen table. $85,000 to something called Crypto Future Holdings, which doesn't appear to exist anymore. $15,000 to a poker site that's currently under federal investigation for money laundering. $22,000 in cash withdrawals over the past 6 months, with no documentation of where that money went. Tyler's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But my personal favorite, Vince continued, is this $30,000 payment to a company called Luxury Lifestyle Consulting. Want to guess what kind of consulting they provide? Tyler remained silent. Escort services, Tyler. High-end prostitutes for men who want to pretend there's something more than they are. You spent $30,000 of family money on whores. Dad, I can explain. No, Vince said simply. You can't. Because there's no explanation that makes this acceptable. You've been burning through money like a lottery winner with brain damage, and now you're going to learn what life looks like when a free ride ends. Tyler's desperation gave way to anger. Fine. You want to destroy your own son over mom's mistakes? Go ahead. But don't pretend this is about morality or family values. This is about your ego. You're right, Vince agreed. This is about my ego and my respect. And my refusal to continue enabling a family of parasites who think my silence means I'm weak. Parasites. Tyler's voice rose. I'm your son. You're a 23-year-old man who's never held a real job, never paid his own bills, and apparently thinks prostitutes are a legitimate business expense. What exactly about that relationship am I supposed to cherish? Tyler stared at his father for a long moment. And Vince could see the exact instant when his son's last illusion shattered. Tyler had always assumed that no matter what he did, no matter how badly he behaved, his father would eventually forgive him and bail him out. Now he was realizing that assumption had been catastrophically wrong. You're really going to throw me away, Tyler said quietly. Over Mom and Bobby. I'm not throwing you away over them, Vince replied. I'm throwing you away because of who you've chosen to be. Your mother's affair was just the catalyst. The real problem is that you're a man with no character, no integrity, and no respect for anyone but yourself. Tyler's face twisted with rage and hurt. Well, fuck you too, Dad. I hope you're happy sitting alone in this house, counting your money and congratulating yourself on how righteous you are. I will be, Vince said. Thank you for asking. Tyler stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Vince watched through the kitchen window as his son climbed into his car, a car that Vince had bought and insured, though Tyler would discover tomorrow that the insurance had been canceled and the registration was about to expire. At 2 p.m., Vince's phone rang. It was Frank Rodriguez, calling from a job site. Vince, Frank said, his voice tight with concern, we've got a problem. Bobby Hayes just showed up here with a court order, claiming he has a right to inspect our work on the Grandview project. What kind of court order? Vince asked, though he already knew the answer. Some kind of emergency injunction. He's claiming we used substandard materials, that the work doesn't meet code, that kind of bullshit. He's got lawyers with him and everything. Vince smiled. Bobby was panicking, grasping at straws, trying to find some way to strike back. It was exactly what Vince had expected. Frank, he said, do me a favor. Let him inspect whatever he wants. Give him full access, complete cooperation. Make sure the lawyers see everything they want to see. Are you sure? This feels like trouble. Trust me, Vince said. This is exactly what we want. Because what Bobby didn't know was that Vince had been preparing for this exact scenario for months. Every material used on the Grandview project was not just up to code. It exceeded code by significant margins. Every permit was not just in order. It was backed up by redundant documentation and independent inspections. Bobby would find absolutely nothing wrong with the construction, which would make his desperate legal maneuver look like exactly what it was, the flailing of a desperate man. More importantly, Bobby's court filing would create a public record of his accusations against Morrison Construction, which would allow Vince to file a countersuit for defamation and tortious interference with business relationships. That countersuit would open Bobby's business practices to discovery, which would expose all the corners he'd cut and all the rules he'd bent over the years. Bobby thought he was launching an attack. In reality, he was walking into a trap that would destroy what remained of his credibility and his business. At 4 p.m., Vince received a call from his lawyer, confirming that the EPA investigation into Bobby's development projects had officially begun. Federal investigators were already on site at 2 of Bobby's properties, and a local media had picked up the story. By evening, Bobby Hayes would be the lead story on every news outlet in the county. At 6 p.m., Linda called. "Vince," she said, her voice hollow, "I'm at Bobby's house. The federal agents are here. They're asking about you, about Morrison Construction, about whether you had any involvement in Bobby's projects." "And what are you telling them?" Vince asked. "The truth. That you never worked with Bobby, that you always said his company was sloppy and cut corners." "That is the truth," Vince confirmed. "I've never done business with Bobby Hayes, and I never would have." "They're going to destroy him," Linda said quietly. "They're talking about criminal charges, about federal prison." "I imagine they are. He's not a bad man, Vince. He made mistakes, but he's not evil." Vince considered this for a moment. "Linda," he said finally, "Bobby Hayes knowingly built residential developments on contaminated land. He exposed families to toxic chemicals because proper remediation would have cut into his profit margins." "What would you call that?" Linda was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I want to come home." "This isn't your home anymore," Vince replied. "It never really was. You just lived here." "Vince, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can work through this." "No," he said simply. "We can't. Some things can't be fixed, Linda. They can only be ended." As he hung up the phone, Vince looked around the house where he'd spent 15 years building a life with people who had never truly been on his side. Tomorrow, the demolition would be complete. By the end of the week, Bobby Hayes would be facing federal charges and financial ruin. Tyler would be learning what life looked like without a safety net. And Linda would be discovering that her choices had consequences she'd never imagined. Vince Morrison had spent his career building things that lasted. Now he was learning that sometimes the most important thing you could build was the destruction of people who deserved it. Chapter 6, The Reckoning. Thursday morning brought news that exceeded even Vince's expectations. Bobby Hayes had been arrested at 6 a.m. on federal charges of environmental fraud, conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act, and endangering public health. The arrest had been coordinated with raids on his offices and construction sites, where FBI agents had seized computers, files, and financial records dating back 5 years. Vince learned about the arrest not from the news, but from Tyler, who called at 7 a.m. in a state of complete panic. "Dad, you have to help me," Tyler said without preamble. "The FBI was at my apartment this morning. They're asking about money Bobby gave me, about whether I knew about his business practices." "Did Bobby give you money?" Vince asked, though he already suspected the answer. He helped me out a few times. When I was short on rent, when the crypto thing went bad. But I didn't know anything about contaminated land or federal violations or any of that shit." "How much money, Tyler?" "I don't know, maybe 40,000 total, but it wasn't for anything illegal. It was just loans, personal loans between friends." Vince almost laughed. Tyler had been taking money from a man who was sleeping with his mother, money that had likely come from fraudulent development deals, and he was surprised that federal investigators found this interesting. "Tyler," Vince said, "you need a lawyer. A good one. And you need to stop talking to anyone about anything until you have one." "I can't afford a lawyer. You canceled my trust fund, remember? I've got maybe $300 to my name." "Then you should probably find a public defender," Vince replied. "Or maybe ask your mother's boyfriend to recommend someone." "Oh, wait, he's in federal custody. This is your fault." Tyler exploded. "You did this. You destroyed Bobby to get back at Mom, and now I'm caught in the middle." "No," Vince said calmly. "This is your fault. You took money from a criminal, Tyler. You took money that wasn't legitimately earned from a man who was destroying the environment and endangering families for profit. The fact that you didn't know he was a criminal just means you're stupid, not innocent. Tyler's voice became desperate. Dad, please. I know I fucked up. I know I've been a disappointment, but I'm still your son. You can't just let me hang out here. Watch me, Vince said and hung up. At 9 a.m., Vince drove to the Morrison Construction offices to finalize the transition of his company to his partner and longtime friend, Frank Rodriguez. It was a partnership they discussed for years, and Frank had the experience and integrity to run the company successfully. More importantly, Frank understood Vince's standards and would maintain the reputation for quality that Morrison Construction had built over 3 decades. Health of a week, Frank said as they signed the final paperwork. Bobby Hayes in federal custody. Your boy Tyler apparently mixed up in money laundering, and Linda, well, I guess Linda's learning what it's like to pick the wrong horse. It's been educational, Vince agreed. Frank studied his former partner's face. You don't seem surprised by any of this. I'm not. Vince, Frank said carefully, I've known you for 15 years. You're not the kind of man who gets blindsided by his wife's affair. And you're definitely not the kind of man who lets it go without a response. Vince signed the last document and slid it across the desk. Frank, sometimes the best response to betrayal is patience. People who think they're smarter than you will eventually prove they're not. Frank nodded slowly. And sometimes they'll prove it in spectacular fashion. Sometimes they will, Vince agreed. At 11 a.m., Vince received a call from his lawyer with an update on the Bobby Hayes situation. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence of a pattern of environmental fraud spanning multiple developments over 5 years. Bobby was facing a minimum of 10 years in federal prison if convicted, and the cleanup costs for the contaminated properties could exceed $20 million, money that Bobby's company didn't have. But the real revelation was that the investigation had also uncovered evidence of systematic bribery and corruption. Bobby had been paying off local building inspectors, environmental officials, and zoning board members to overlook violations and fast-track approvals. The corruption investigation was likely to expose dozens of other officials and potentially trigger a complete overhaul of the county's development oversight system. It's a complete disaster for everyone involved, the lawyer told Vince. Hayes is finished, his company is bankrupt, and half the county government is going to be under federal investigation. Terrible shame, Vince said, not sounding particularly upset about it. At 1 p.m., Linda arrived at the house. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in the past week, her usually perfect hair unwashed and her designer clothes wrinkled. She no longer looked like the confident woman who'd been sneaking around behind his back. She looked like what she was, a middle-aged woman who'd made catastrophically bad choices and was finally facing the consequences. Vince, she said when he answered the door, we need to talk. About what? He replied, not inviting her in. About what's going to happen now. About Tyler, about the house, about our divorce. Our divorce is going to be simple, Vince said. You're going to get exactly what you brought to this marriage, which was nothing. The house, the business, the investments, all of that stays with me. That's not how divorce works in this state, Linda said, trying to summon some of her old defiance. I'm entitled to half of everything we built together. We didn't build anything together, Vince replied. I built everything while you spent it. And you're going to discover that proving your contribution to a 30-year marriage is difficult when you've spent the last 18 months committing adultery with a federal criminal. Linda's face crumpled. You're really going to destroy me over this. Linda, Vince said patiently, I'm not destroying you. You destroyed yourself. I'm just declining to save you from the consequences. What about Tyler? Are you really going to let your own son go to prison? Tyler's not going to prison, Vince said. He's too small a fish for the federal prosecutors to care about. He'll probably get probation and community service, assuming he can convince them he was just stupid instead of malicious. And then what? What's he supposed to do with his life? He's supposed to figure that out himself, Vince replied. He's 23 years old, Linda. It's time he learned how to be an adult. Linda stared at him for a long moment, as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. You planned all of this, she said quietly. The investigation, the arrests, the timing. You orchestrated all of it. I provided information to the appropriate authorities, Vince said. What they did with that information was their choice. You destroyed Bobby's life. Bobby destroyed his own life. I just documented it. Linda's voice became small, almost childlike. What am I supposed to do now? Vince considered the question seriously. You're 45 years old, Linda. You have a college degree and 18 months of experience lying to people who trusted you. I'm sure you'll figure something out. He started to close the door, but Linda's voice stopped him. I loved you, she said desperately. At the beginning, I really loved you. Vince paused, looking at this woman who'd shared his bed for 15 years and his life for even longer. I know you did, he said finally. That's what makes this so unforgivable. As he closed the door, Vince reflected on the destruction he'd orchestrated over the past week. Bobby Hayes was finished, facing federal prison and financial ruin that would follow him for the rest of his life. Tyler was learning that actions had consequences and that his father's patience had limits. And Linda was discovering that betrayal was a luxury she couldn't afford. But this was only the beginning. The real reckoning was yet to come. Chapter 7: The Collapse. 2 weeks after Bobby's arrest, the full scope of the scandal had become clear. The federal investigation had metastasized into a multi-agency probe involving the FBI, EPA, IRS, and State Attorney General's office. 47 people had been arrested or indicted, including 3 county commissioners, 5 building inspectors, and the entire zoning board. The local media was calling it the largest corruption scandal in the county's history. Vince watched the coverage from his home office, methodically working through his files and preparing for the next phase of his plan. Bobby's arrest had been satisfying, but was only the first movement in a larger symphony of destruction that Vince had been composing for months. Tyler had managed to avoid federal charges, but not consequences. Unable to afford a private attorney, he'd been assigned a public defender who negotiated a plea deal requiring full cooperation with federal investigators, 2 years of probation, and community service. More importantly for Vince's purposes, Tyler's cooperation had included detailed statements about Bobby's financial relationship with the Morrison family. Statements that painted Tyler as a victim of manipulation rather than a willing participant in corruption. The irony wasn't lost on Vince that Tyler's natural tendency towards self-pity and blame-shifting had actually helped him avoid prison. Tyler was so convincingly pathetic in his interviews with federal agents that they concluded he was too stupid and self-absorbed to be part of any conspiracy. Linda had moved into a small apartment across town, taking a job as a receptionist at a dental office, the first paying job she'd held in 20 years. The woman who'd once spent Vince's money on designer clothes and expensive vacations was now answering phones for $12 an hour and learning how to budget for groceries. But Vince wasn't finished with any of them. On a Thursday morning in October, Tyler appeared at the house unannounced. He looked thinner than he had 2 weeks earlier, and his usual arrogance had been replaced by something approaching humility. "Dad," he said when Vince opened the door, "I need to ask you something." "Ask away," Vince replied, not inviting him in. "Did you know?" Tyler asked. "When you planned all this, when you set up Bobby and destroyed Mom's life, did you know I was going to get caught up in it?" Vince considered the question. "Yes." Tyler's face went white. "You knew the FBI would investigate me?" "I knew that anyone who'd taken money from Bobby Hayes would face scrutiny," Vince said. "I also knew that you'd taken money from him because I've been monitoring your financial activity since you turned 18. You've been spying on me for 5 years." "I've been watching out for you for 5 years," Vince corrected. "There's a difference. And what I saw was a young man with no judgment, no self-control, and no understanding of consequences." Tyler's voice cracked. "So you decided to teach me about consequences by destroying my life?" "I decided to stop protecting you from the consequences of your own choices," Vince replied. "Everything that happened to you, Tyler, was the result of decisions you made. I just stopped cleaning up the mess. I could have gone to prison." "Yes," Vince agreed. "You could have. The fact that you didn't is a testament to your attorney's skill and the federal prosecutor's mercy, not to your innocence." Tyler stared at his father for a long moment, and Vince could see the wheels turning in his son's head as he tried to process the reality of his situation. "You really hate me," Tyler said finally. "No," Vince said. "I don't hate you. Hatred requires emotional investment, and I don't have any emotional investment in you anymore. The brutality of the statement hit Tyler like a physical blow. I'm your son. You're a man who shares my DNA and my last name, Vince replied. Beyond that, we have nothing in common. Tyler's composure finally cracked completely. Dad, please. I know I fucked up. I know I've been a disappointment, but I can change. I can be better. No, Vince said simply. You can't. Because change requires character, and character requires the ability to accept responsibility for your actions. You've just spent 5 minutes trying to blame me for the consequences of your own choices. Then what am I supposed to do? Tyler demanded. How am I supposed to live with knowing that my own father considers me worthless? Vince thought about this question for a moment. Tyler, he said finally, for the past 23 years, you've lived with my financial support, my connections, and my protection for consequences. Now you're going to learn what life looks like when you have to earn those things yourself. And if I can't, then you'll fail, Vince said. And that will be your choice, not mine. As Tyler walked away, Vince felt no satisfaction, no triumph, no sense of justice served. He felt only the cold completion of a necessary task. Tyler had been given every advantage in life and had chosen to waste them all. There was nothing left to do but let him face the world on his own terms. That afternoon, Vince received a call from his private investigator with news about Bobby Hayes. Bobby's legal troubles had multiplied beyond the federal charges. The families affected by the contaminated developments had filed a class action lawsuit seeking damages for health problems and property devaluation. Several environmental groups had joined the lawsuit, seeking punitive damages and demanding criminal prosecution at the state level as well as federal. But the most interesting development was personal. Bobby's wife had filed for divorce and was seeking an emergency restraining order, claiming that Bobby had become violent and threatening as his legal troubles mounted. She was also seeking sole custody of their 2 children and had moved them out of state to live with her parents. It gets better, the investigator told Vince. Hayes' business partners have all filed lawsuits to dissolve their partnerships and recover their investments. His company's assets are being liquidated to pay legal fees and settlement costs. And the IRS has frozen his personal accounts pending a tax fraud investigation. How is he holding up personally? Vince asked. Not well. My sources say he's drinking heavily, barely sleeping, and spending most of his time with lawyers who are billing him $300 an hour to tell him how fucked he is. Vince thanked the investigator and hung up, satisfied that Bobby Hayes was experiencing the full weight of consequences he'd avoided for years. Men like Bobby operated under the assumption that their wealth and connections made them untouchable. Discovering that assumption was wrong was always a devastating experience. That evening, Linda called. Vince, she said, her voice smaller than he'd ever heard it, Tyler told me about your conversation today. Did he? He said you told him you have no emotional investment in him anymore. That's correct. Linda was quiet for a long moment. Is that how you feel about me, too? Vince considered the question carefully. Linda, he said finally, you were my wife for 15 years. You were the mother of my child, my partner in building a life together. I loved you completely and trusted you absolutely. And now you're a stranger who used to live in my house. He could hear her crying softly on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Vince. I'm so sorry for everything. I know you are, he replied. But apologies don't undo betrayal, Linda. They just acknowledge it. As he hung up the phone, Vince realized that the destruction phase of his plan was nearly complete. Bobby Hayes was facing decades in prison and financial ruin. Tyler was learning to navigate life without a safety net. Linda was discovering what independence looked like when you were starting over at 45. But there was still one more act to play out. One final lesson to teach about the price of betrayal and the cost of assuming that Vincent Morrison's silence meant weakness. The reckoning was almost complete. Chapter 8, The Final Move. Spring came early to the county, and with it came the culmination of the federal prosecution that had consumed the local news for months. Bobby Hayes had pled guilty to 14 federal charges in exchange for a recommended sentence of 12 years in federal prison and forfeiture of all his business assets. The plea hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in April, and Vince planned to attend. He arrived at the federal courthouse early, taking a seat in the back of the gallery where he could observe without drawing attention. The courtroom gradually filled with reporters, FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and a handful of Bobby's former associates who had managed to avoid prosecution themselves. Bobby looked nothing like the confident, swaggering man who had attended Vince's retirement party 8 months earlier. He'd lost at least 30 pounds. His expensive suits had been replaced by an ill-fitting public defender special, and his once perfect hair was showing gray at the roots. When he entered the courtroom in handcuffs, flanked by federal marshals, he looked like exactly what he was, a broken man facing the destruction of everything he'd spent his life building. The hearing itself was brief and procedural. Bobby answered the judge's questions in a quiet, defeated voice, confirming his understanding of the charges and his decision to plead guilty. When asked if he wished to make a statement before sentencing, he declined. But as Bobby was led away in handcuffs, his eyes found Vince in the gallery. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the courtroom. Bobby's expression was a mixture of rage, defeat, and something that might have been respect. He knew exactly who was responsible for his downfall, and he knew there was nothing he could do about it. Vince nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged Bobby's recognition without gloating. Then Bobby was gone, led away to begin a federal prison sentence that would consume the rest of his productive life. Outside the courthouse, Vince was approached by a young reporter from the local newspaper who had been covering the corruption scandal. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I'm Rebecca Santos from the Grandview Gazette. Could I ask you a few questions about the Hayes case?" "I'm not sure what I could tell you that would be useful," Vince replied politely. "Well, several sources have indicated that your company's environmental reports were instrumental in triggering the federal investigation. And there are allegations that Hayes had been targeting your business for acquisition as part of his expansion plans." Vince smiled slightly. "Ms. Santos, I've been in the construction business for 30 years. In that time, I've learned that the most important thing you can do is maintain high standards and document everything carefully. Sometimes that documentation proves useful in unexpected ways." "Are you saying you knew Hayes was violating environmental regulations?" "I'm saying that anyone who did business in this county and paid attention to details would have noticed irregularities in how certain projects were approved and executed," Vince replied. "The question is whether they chose to do anything about it." The reporter scribbled notes furiously. "And you chose to do something about it?" "I chose to provide relevant information to the appropriate authorities," Vince said. "What they did with that information was their decision." "What about the personal aspect? Hayes was reportedly involved with your ex-wife." Vince's expression didn't change. "Ms. Santos, my personal life is private. But I will say this. A man's character is revealed not by what he does when people are watching, but by what he does when he thinks no one will find out." The reporter looked up from her notes. "Are you talking about Hayes or about yourself?" "I'm talking about both of us," Vince replied. That evening, Vince drove to Tyler's apartment. His son was living in a rundown complex on the wrong side of town, sharing a 2-bedroom unit with a roommate he'd found on Craigslist. It was a far cry from the luxury he'd grown up with, but it was what Tyler could afford on his salary from the construction job Frank Rodriguez had reluctantly given him. Tyler answered the door in work clothes that were actually dirty from honest labor. The past 8 months had changed him in ways that Vince hadn't expected. The soft edges of privilege had been worn away by necessity, and there was something in his son's eyes that hadn't been there before, the beginning of self-respect earned through effort rather than entitlement. "Dad," Tyler said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see how you were doing," Vince replied. Tyler stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small and cheaply furnished, but it was clean and organized. Vince could see textbooks on a table near the window. Tyler was apparently taking night classes in construction management. "I'm doing okay," Tyler said, following his father's gaze to the books. "Frank's been teaching me the business from the ground up, starting at the bottom, learning how things actually work instead of just talking about them." "How do you like it?" Tyler considered the question. "It's hard. Harder than I thought it would be. But it's honest, you know. When I fuck up, it's my fault. And when I do good work, I earned it." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Tyler spoke again. I saw the news about Bobby's sentencing. 12 years. Yes. Do you feel satisfied? Getting your revenge? Vince thought about the question. Tyler, he said finally, this was never about revenge. It was about consequences. Bobby Hayes spent years cutting corners, violating regulations, and endangering people for profit. Those actions had consequences, and he finally had to face them. And Mom? And me? Or are consequences for? Your mother's consequences were for betraying her marriage and her family, Vince replied. Your consequences were for taking money from a criminal and assuming that I would always be there to clean up your mistakes. Tyler nodded slowly. And now you're learning to be a man instead of a child, Vince said. It's hard work, but it's the most important work you'll ever do. Tyler was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, more mature than Vince had ever heard it. Dad, he said, I know I don't have any right to ask this, and I know I haven't earned it, but is there any chance we could have a relationship again someday? Well, I've proven that I've changed. Vince studied his son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or false sentiment. But what he saw was genuine uncertainty and something that might have been hope. Tyler, he said carefully, change isn't something you prove with words. It's something you demonstrate with actions, over time, consistently. If you can do that, if you can become a man of character and integrity, then we can talk about having a relationship. How long? Tyler asked. As long as it takes, Vince replied. As he drove home, Vince reflected on the conversation. Tyler was beginning to understand the difference between privilege and respect, between entitlement and earning. It was possible that the destruction of his comfortable life might actually save him in the end. Linda, on the other hand, was a different story entirely. She called later that evening. Vince, she said, I heard about Bobby's sentencing on the news. Did you? 12 years. He'll be 60 when he gets out. If he gets out. If he serves his full sentence, yes. Linda was quiet for a moment. I went to see him before the hearing. To say goodbye. How is he? Broken, she said simply. Completely broken. He keeps talking about how you destroyed him, how you planned everything, how you're some kind of criminal mastermind. And what do you think? I think, Linda said slowly, that you're exactly who you always were. You just stopped protecting us from the consequences of our choices. It was, Vince realized, the most insightful thing Linda had said in years. Linda, he said, I want you to understand something. What happened to Bobby, what happened to Tyler, what happened to you? None of it was punishment. It was just the natural result of the choices you made. I know, she said quietly. I finally understand that. Good, Vince replied. Understanding consequences is the first step toward making better choices. After he hung up, Vince poured himself a whiskey and sat in his home office, looking out at the garden where Linda had once entertained her book club friends with stories about her perfect marriage. The house was quiet now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been for years. Vincent Morrison had spent 8 months systematically destroying the lives of everyone who had betrayed him. But as he sat in the silence of his empty house, he realized that destruction had never been the goal. The goal had been truth, the truth about character, about consequences, and about the price of betrayal. Some lessons could only be learned through devastation. And some people could only find redemption after losing everything they thought they valued. The reckoning was complete. Chapter 9. The New Foundation. 1 year after Bobby Hayes' sentencing, Vincent Morrison stood on the construction site of his latest project, a community center in the part of town where Tyler now lived. It wasn't a Morrison construction project. Vince had officially retired from the business he'd built over 30 years. But he'd personally funded the community center and was overseeing its construction as a volunteer project. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was building something in the neighborhood where his son had learned to rebuild his life from the ground up. Tyler arrived at the site at lunchtime, as he did most days when his work schedule allowed. He'd been promoted twice in the past year, earning recognition for his attention to detail and his willingness to work harder than anyone expected. Frank Rodriguez had told Vince that Tyler was becoming one of his most reliable foremen, a young man who led by example rather than entitlement. How's it coming along? Tyler asked, studying the progress on the center's main hall. On schedule and under budget, Vince replied. Your friend Martinez did excellent work on the electrical systems. Tyler smiled at that. Martinez was his roommate, an electrician who'd taught Tyler more about practical skills in the past year than he'd learned in 4 years of college. More importantly, Martinez had taught Tyler about earning respect through competence rather than connections. Dad, Tyler said, using the word for the first time in months, I wanted to tell you something. Vince stopped reviewing the blueprints and gave his son his full attention. I've been saving money, Tyler continued. Not much, but some every month. I want to pay you back for the trust fund money I wasted. It's going to take me a long time, but I want to pay back every dollar. Vince studied his son's face. Why? Because it was my responsibility and I fucked it up. Because taking your money and throwing it away was stealing from you, even if it was legal. And because I want to know that I can earn things instead of just taking them. It was, Vince realized, the first time Tyler had ever talked about taking responsibility for something without trying to justify his actions or blame someone else. All right, Vince said simply. We can work out a payment plan. Tyler nodded gratefully. There's something else. I'm thinking about going back to school. Not for business, for engineering. Frank thinks I might have a talent for structural design. What made you interested in that? Tyler gestured toward the community center taking shape around them. Watching you work on this project. Seeing how you think about not just what you're building, but why you're building it and how long it needs to last. It's not just construction. It's creating something that serves a purpose. Vince felt something he hadn't experienced in years when thinking about his son. Pride. Engineering is good work, he said. Honest work. That's what I'm learning, Tyler replied. That honest work is the only kind that actually matters. That evening, Vince drove to Linda's apartment. She called him earlier in the week, asking if they could talk. He'd agreed, though he wasn't sure what they still had to discuss. Linda met him at the door, wearing the kind of simple clothes she'd never worn during their marriage. Jeans, a sweater, minimal makeup. She looked older than her 46 years, but there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Peace. Thank you for coming, she said, leading him to the small living room. I know this is awkward. What did you want to talk about? Vince asked. Linda sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. I wanted to tell you that I'm getting married. Vince raised an eyebrow. Congratulations. Anyone I know. His name is David Miller. He's a teacher at the high school where I've been working as a counselor. He's a good man, Vince. Nothing like Bobby. I'm glad you're happy, Vince said, and found that he meant it. He knows about everything, Linda continued. About the affair, about Bobby, about how our marriage ended. I told him all of it because I didn't want to start something new with lies. That was wise. Linda smiled sadly. It took me a long time to learn the difference between wisdom and cleverness. I thought I was being smart, having my affair, keeping my options open. I thought I could have everything I wanted without anyone getting hurt. And now I understand that every choice has a price, she said, and that the price of dishonesty is always higher than you think it's going to be. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Linda spoke again. Vince, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. All right, when you destroyed Bobby, when you let Tyler face consequences, when you divorced me and left me with nothing, were you trying to teach us lessons, or were you just punishing us? Vince thought about the question for a long time. Both, he said finally. I was angry, Linda, angrier than I'd ever been in my life. And yes, part of me wanted you all to suffer the way I was suffering. And the other part wanted you to understand that actions have consequences. That betrayal isn't something you can just apologize for and move on from. That respect and trust, once lost, have to be earned back through years of consistent behavior. Linda nodded. I think I understand that now. It took losing everything, but I understand it. Are you happy? Vince asked. I'm learning to be, Linda replied. For the first time in my life, I'm earning my own money, making my own decisions, living with the consequences of my own choices. It's scary, but it's also honest. As Vince drove home, he reflected on how much had changed in the 2 years since his retirement party. Bobby Hayes was serving his federal sentence in a minimum security prison. His wife had divorced him, and his children barely knew him. Tyler was learning to be a man through hard work and responsibility. Linda was learning to find happiness through honesty rather than manipulation. And Vince himself had learned something unexpected, that the most devastating revenge wasn't destruction for its own sake, but forcing people to confront the truth about themselves and their choices. The house felt different when he walked in that evening. Not empty, but peaceful. He poured himself a whiskey and sat in his study, looking at the framed photograph on his desk, a picture of the community center's groundbreaking ceremony. In the background, barely visible, Tyler could be seen working alongside the other construction crew members. Vincent Morrison had spent his career building structures that would last generations. But his greatest construction project had been the slow, careful rebuilding of his son's character from the ground up. It had required tearing down everything Tyler thought he knew about himself and starting over with a foundation of honesty, responsibility, and earned respect. Some structures could only be built on the ruins of what came before. And some lessons could only be learned when everything you thought you knew about yourself was stripped away, leaving only the choice between growth and collapse. Vince raised his glass in a silent toast to the future, to Tyler's engineering studies, to Linda's second chance at honest happiness, and to the community center that would serve families for generations to come. The foundation was solid now. Everything built on it would last. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.